Your favorite football club's legendary academy may no longer simply be a place where the next generation of stars is developed. For a growing number of investors, it is becoming something much more interesting: an asset, a pipeline, and a network capable of generating future transfer revenue. Across European football, a new financial strategy is emerging as investors move beyond simply buying established clubs and expensive first-team players, and instead look further down the football pyramid. Buying clubs, investing in academies, building scouting networks, and trying to control the journey of a player before that player ever becomes a household name. This is the talent arbitrage strategy, and the basic idea is surprisingly simple. A young player developed in one market can be worth relatively little today, but if that same player eventually reaches a major European league, their value can increase dramatically. So why wait until they are expensive when you can invest in their development much earlier? That logic fits perfectly with the rise of multi-club ownership, where an investment group can control several clubs across different countries and levels of the football pyramid, allowing one club to act as the flagship, while another provides a development environment, and another gives young players the opportunity to gain professional experience. Suddenly, the group isn't simply buying football clubs. It is building a system in which players can be identified, developed, moved between clubs, and eventually sold when their market value reaches its peak. The value isn't necessarily in winning trophies at every club, because sometimes the real value is in developing the right players and creating a pathway through which they can eventually reach the biggest leagues in Europe. Research published in 2026 describes multi-club ownership as an increasingly important business model, with investors using these networks to pursue talent development, operational synergies, and financial returns, although not every ownership group operates in exactly the same way. Some are genuinely trying to integrate football operations and create sporting advantages, while others are much more financially focused, and that difference raises an important question. Is an academy primarily developing players for its own first team, or is it developing players for a much larger network? Imagine being a 15-year-old footballer at a local academy, where your coaches see you as a potential first-team player, while the ownership group sees something else: a young prospect whose value could eventually reach millions. That doesn't necessarily mean anyone is doing anything illegal, but it does change the incentives, and technology is making this process increasingly sophisticated. Scouting once depended heavily on human observation, with scouts traveling to matches, watching players, taking notes, talking to coaches, and building relationships over years. But today, clubs can combine those observations with enormous amounts of data covering physical performance, technical actions, match footage, age, position, and development trajectory. The result is a football market where clubs can identify potential much earlier, because a player isn't simply being evaluated on what they are today. They are being evaluated on what they might become 5 years from now. A 14-year-old isn't valuable because of what they can contribute to a first team today, but because of the possibility that they could eventually become a professional footballer worth millions, which makes youth development resemble an investment option. Put a relatively small amount of money into a prospect today for the possibility of generating a much larger return tomorrow. Once you look at youth academies through that lens, the geography of European football becomes incredibly important, particularly in countries such as France and Portugal, which have developed strong reputations for producing young talent through established academies and well-developed pathways into Europe's biggest leagues. That makes clubs in these countries attractive pieces within larger networks, because a player can be developed in one environment, gain professional experience somewhere else, and potentially move into a major league once their market value has increased. The same basic concept is appearing across Europe, which helps explain why multi-club ownership has expanded so rapidly. The goal is not simply to own more teams, but to gain control over scouting, development, playing pathways, and ultimately the economic value created when players move between clubs. This brings us to one of football's most sensitive subjects: third-party ownership. The idea that an outside party could hold economic rights connected to a player's future transfers has been controversial for decades, and UEFA has explicitly opposed third-party ownership because of the conflicts of interest and incentives it can create. Modern regulations are much tighter, but regulation doesn't eliminate the underlying economic incentive. Instead, it changes how investors can structure their involvement. Investors don't necessarily need to own a percentage of a player's transfer rights to benefit from player development, because they can own the club, invest in the academy, own multiple clubs, build scouting infrastructure, and create development pathways, meaning that if a player eventually generates a major transfer fee for one of those clubs, the ownership group can benefit through the increased value and revenue of the club itself. That distinction is crucial because the player isn't being treated as property, but the infrastructure surrounding that player's development can become an investment asset, and this is where the debate becomes much more complicated. There are genuine benefits to this model because youth academies are expensive, training facilities cost money, coaches need to be paid, scouting networks require investment, and young players need education, accommodation, medical support, nutrition, and professional development. Outside capital can dramatically improve those things, giving a struggling academy better facilities, better coaching, better analytics, and access to scouting networks that it could never afford on its own. So if the investment works, the club gets stronger, the player gets better, and the investor gets a return. But there is another side to the equation. What happens when the financial return becomes more important than the sporting identity of the club? Football isn't just an investment. It is local, emotional, and deeply connected to cities, neighborhoods, families, and generations of supporters. And an academy is often one of the strongest expressions of that identity. The local kid who grows up supporting the club, joins the academy, makes his debut, and eventually scores in front of the home supporters can become a symbol of everything that makes football different from other industries. But imagine a talented 15-year-old entering an academy, developing rapidly, and being viewed by the ownership group primarily as a high-potential prospect who could eventually generate a significant transfer fee. Before local supporters ever get to see that player establish himself in the first team, he could be moved somewhere else within the network because, financially, that might make perfect sense. Sportingly, it could even be the best decision for the player's development, but culturally, it can feel very different because the academy stops feeling like a destination and starts feeling like part of a larger talent pipeline. This is where the concept of academy flipping becomes important. The idea that young players can be developed primarily because they have the potential to be sold for a profit rather than because they are expected to become long-term members of the club. Again, that doesn't mean every academy within a multi-club structure operates this way, but it raises a difficult question. At what point does player development stop being about building a team and start being about building an investment portfolio? And there is an even bigger question. What happens if this strategy actually succeeds? Imagine a future where the largest investment groups control networks of clubs across Europe, giving them access to advanced scouting technology, high-quality development facilities, enormous recruitment networks, and multiple clubs where players can develop at different levels. A small independent club could suddenly find itself competing against an organization with billions of dollars behind its scouting and development operation, and the advantage wouldn't simply be money spent on the first team. It would be money spent years earlier, finding the player before everyone else, developing them before everyone else, and creating a pathway for them before everyone else. That is the essence of talent arbitrage, and it could fundamentally change the transfer market. Although there is one major reason not to assume that the strategy automatically works. A 14-year-old is not a financial asset in the same way as a stock because human development is unpredictable. Players get injured, lose motivation, stop developing, or simply fail to become the superstar that scouts and algorithms expected them to become. And recent research into multi-club ownership even challenges the assumption that these networks automatically produce better sporting results. A 2026 study examining more than 2,000 club season observations found no systematic improvement in league performance associated with multi-club ownership, meaning that owning more clubs doesn't magically make an organization better at football. That matters because the financial model depends on identifying enough successful players to compensate for the prospects who never reach the highest level, making youth development a high-risk, high-upside strategy in which a single major success can potentially compensate for years of development costs. But unlike a traditional financial asset, the underlying asset is a human being whose development cannot be perfectly predicted, and that may ultimately be the biggest limitation of the entire strategy. So where does football go from here? I don't think private equity is going to destroy football, and I don't think every multi-club ownership group is secretly trying to turn teenagers into financial instruments. The reality is much more complicated because football needs investment, academies need investment, smaller clubs need investment, and better infrastructure can genuinely create better opportunities for young players. But money changes incentives, And when the financial value of developing a player becomes enormous, clubs have to decide what they are actually trying to optimize: winning, developing local talent, building a sustainable business, or maximizing the value of every player who passes through the system. Those goals can overlap, but they don't always, and that's where the future of football becomes so interesting. The next major transformation of the sport may not happen on the pitch. It may happen inside the academy, where the real competition could be over who discovers the next superstar first, who develops them best, who controls their pathway, and who ultimately captures the value they create. The billionaire race isn't necessarily about owning today's best footballers. It's about owning the infrastructure that produces tomorrow's. And if that trend continues, Europe's football academies could become something very different from what they were designed to be. Not just schools for young footballers, and not just symbols of local identity, but the first stage of a global talent economy. That leaves us with the biggest question of all. If more investment creates better facilities, better coaching, and more opportunities for young players, is football becoming healthier? Or are we simply getting better at turning the future of the sport into an asset class? Because a football club can survive without winning every season, and it can survive without signing the biggest stars. But if it loses the connection between its academy, its community, and its identity, it may eventually lose the very thing that made people care about it in the first place. The future of football may be more efficient, more data-driven, more global, and much more profitable, but the question is whether it will still feel like football. Expertise dive. One topic, deep dive. No surface-level answers. What should we dive into next?